Have you ever wondered why, no matter how much you do for others, it never feels like it's enough? You give your time, your energy, even your dreams away, yet deep inside, there's still an emptiness, an ache that whispers, "What about me?" We live in a world that constantly tells us to be selfless, to sacrifice, to put everyone else before ourselves. We're told that's what makes us good people, good parents, good friends, good partners. And yes, giving is beautiful, but what happens when giving turns into self-erasure? When every decision you make bends toward pleasing others, while your own needs are left starving in the shadows? This is where most of us get lost. We confuse love with overextension, kindness with self-neglect, and humility with silence. But here's the truth. You cannot truly show up for others if you keep abandoning yourself. Putting yourself first doesn't mean shutting the world out. It doesn't mean becoming cold, selfish, or uncaring. It means finally recognizing that your life matters. Your voice, your dreams, your well-being, they matter just as much as anyone else's. And when you honor them, something powerful happens. The world begins to honor them too. Imagine this for a moment, living in alignment with who you are, not who others expect you to be. Waking up every morning knowing that you're not just surviving for someone else's story, but thriving in your own. That is the quiet revolution of putting yourself first. It's not about taking from others, it's about giving yourself the permission to be whole. It's about building boundaries, reclaiming your time, and choosing courage over guilt. And once you start, you'll notice the shift. Your energy feels lighter, your connections grow deeper, and opportunities that once seemed locked suddenly swing wide open. This journey isn't about ego, it's about freedom. Freedom from the weight of other people's expectations. Freedom from the silent resentment that builds when you always say yes. And freedom to live a life that feels authentically yours. So as we step into this exploration together, I invite you to pause for just a moment. Take a deep breath, feel the ground beneath you, and ask yourself a simple question. What would my life look like if I stopped abandoning myself? That question alone has the power to transform everything. Because when you finally put yourself first, the world doesn't close its doors, it opens them wide. We've been told our whole lives that selfishness is a dirty word. It's the label people throw around when someone dares to say no, when someone chooses themselves over endless obligation. From childhood, we're conditioned to believe that wanting something for ourselves makes us wrong, greedy, unkind. But what if that's not the full story? What if there's another kind of selfishness? One that isn't about taking more, but about protecting the little you already have. Think of it like this. If your phone battery is down to 1% and everyone around you is demanding to use it, would you hand it over until it dies completely? Or would you plug it in first, charge it, make sure it's alive, so that later it can actually serve a purpose? That's what positive selfishness is. It's the conscious choice to charge your own battery before the world drains it dry. It's saying, I matter too. This isn't about pushing others away. It's about creating balance. Because without balance, your generosity turns toxic. You give and give and give, until all that's left is resentment, exhaustion, and the quiet bitterness that whispers, why does no one ever do the same for me? Here's the thing. No one can pour from an empty cup. You can't offer love, support, or kindness if you're constantly running on fumes. By choosing to protect your energy, you're not being cruel, you're actually ensuring that when you do show up, you show up fully. Present, alive, real. Think of the people you admire most, not the ones who bend until they break, but the ones who radiate strength, peace, and presence. They're not constantly overextending. They know their limits. They rest when they need to. They give because they want to, not because they're trapped in guilt. That's positive selfishness in action. And here's a truth that may feel uncomfortable at first. Every time you say yes to something that drains you, you're actually saying no to something that could nourish you. Every misplaced yes steals time from your own healing, your own passions, your own life. Positive selfishness is reclaiming that stolen time. It's standing up and saying, I deserve space. I deserve rest. I deserve joy. Not after everyone else is taken care of. Not as a reward when the work is done. But now, Because when you honor yourself first, you create a ripple effect. You teach others how to respect you. You model what healthy love looks like. And slowly, you begin to attract relationships, opportunities, and experiences that reflect that same respect back to you. So the next time that voice of guilt tries to creep in, the one that says, "You're being selfish," pause and ask yourself, am I harming others by honoring my needs, or am I simply keeping myself alive? That question changes everything. There comes a moment in life when you realize people will take as much as you allow. Not because they are all bad or cruel, but because most of us are wired to reach for what's available. If your time, your energy, your kindness are always on the table without limit, the world will keep pulling at them until you are left with nothing. That's why boundaries aren't walls. They're not about shutting everyone out. They are doors with locks. You decide who enters, how long they stay, and under what conditions. Boundaries are an act of self-respect. They're the invisible lines that say, this is where I end and this is where you begin. Without boundaries, your life isn't your own. Think about it. How many times have you said yes when every fiber of your being was screaming no? How many times have you stayed quiet, swallowed your truth, or stretched yourself thin just to keep the peace? Each time, a little piece of you disappears. But when you start drawing boundaries, everything changes. You discover that no is not the end of love. In fact, it's the beginning of real love. Because real love thrives in truth, not in silent sacrifice. Picture someone knocking on your door at midnight, demanding to come in. Would you throw it wide open just because you don't want to upset them? Or would you calmly say, this isn't the right time? The same principle applies to your mental, emotional, and spiritual space. Setting boundaries isn't about punishment, it's about clarity. It's telling the world, here's how you can love me without harming me. And when you express that clearly, two things happen. The right people lean in and the wrong people fall away. Both outcomes are gifts. At first, it feels scary. You'll worry about disappointing others, losing approval, or being judged as difficult. But here's the paradox. The more you protect your boundaries, the more respect you gain. Even those who resist them at first eventually recognize the strength behind them. Because people can only honor what you insist on honoring yourself. And here's the beauty. You don't have to defend your boundaries with anger. You can enforce them with calm, with kindness, with steadiness. A soft but firm no. A gentle reminder that your time is not infinite. A refusal to explain yourself endlessly. Every boundary you create is a seed of freedom. It gives you back your mornings, your energy, your peace of mind. And in that space, you finally have room to grow, to rest, to create, to breathe. So the next time someone crosses a line, remember, you are not obligated to keep the door unlocked just to avoid making them uncomfortable. Your peace is worth protecting. Your life is worth guarding. And every time you honor your boundaries, you send a message to the universe. I am ready to be treated with the same respect I give to myself. That is the quiet power of personal boundaries. They don't just protect you, they define you. Something magical happens the moment you begin honoring yourself. The air feels lighter. The weight you've been carrying for years starts to fall away. And without even trying, the world begins to treat you differently. Why? Because the world is always mirroring back who you are. When you walk into a room tired, drained, apologetic, you attract people who expect you to shrink. But when you walk into that same room grounded, confident, and clear about your worth, suddenly the energy shifts. The same people respond differently, or they drift away, making space for new ones who align with the version of you that finally stands tall. Change begins quietly inside. A new thought, a different decision, choosing to say no where you once said yes, taking a step toward your own dreams instead of living through someone else's expectations. And though it may feel small in the moment, the ripple spreads far wider than you realize. Think about it. The person who chooses self-respect inspires others to do the same. The friend who dares to rest instead of burning out gives silent permission for others to care for themselves too. Change is contagious. When you rise, you raise those around you, whether you intend to or not. And yes, some people will resist. They'll question why you're different, why you're no longer so easy to control, why you won't play the same role you always have. But that resistance isn't proof you're wrong, it's proof you're shifting the pattern. Growth always disrupts what is familiar. Here's the secret: you don't have to force the world to change. You don't need to demand respect or chase love or beg for opportunity. The moment you change the way you show up for yourself, the world reorganizes itself around you. People sense it, doors open, conversations deepen. The noise fades, and what remains is what actually belongs in your life. It's like tuning a radio. When you're stuck in self-neglect, you're broadcasting static, attracting more of the same chaos. But when you tune yourself to self-worth, the frequency sharpens, the music clears, and suddenly the people and experiences that match that frequency can finally reach you. This is why putting yourself first isn't selfish. It's transformative. It's the foundation of every healthy relationship, every dream you dare to pursue, every door that swings open without you having to push. Because the truth is, the world isn't waiting to be convinced. It's waiting for you to decide, to step into your worth, to live as if you matter, because you do. And once you make that decision, you'll see it everywhere. In the respect you command without raising your voice, in the love that feels lighter instead of heavy, in the opportunities that flow instead of force. The world has always been ready. It was just waiting for you to change. There's a quiet weight many of us carry, a weight so subtle that we hardly notice it pressing down on our shoulders every single day. It's the expectations of society, those invisible rules that dictate how we should look, act, succeed, and even how we should love. From the moment we're born, we're given a script. We're told to study hard, get a respectable job, marry at the right age, buy a house, raise a family, and eventually retire after a life that supposedly follows a perfect timeline. And if we stray from that script, the whispers start, the judgment creeps in. Suddenly, it feels like you failed some unspoken test. But here's the truth. These expectations are nothing more than illusions. They're constructs built to keep us inside a box that was never designed with our happiness in mind. Imagine for a moment you're climbing a mountain. You push yourself hard, reaching for the summit, only to realize you've been climbing the wrong peak all along. That's exactly what happens when you chase society's version of success. You might reach the top, but it won't feel like victory. It will feel like emptiness. The danger of living under these expectations is that they quietly rob us of authenticity. You begin to shape your choices not around your desires, but around approval. You pick a career because it sounds impressive, not because it ignites your passion. You stay in relationships that look good from the outside, but suffocate your soul on the inside. You smile in pictures, but behind closed doors, you feel the gnawing ache of a life that doesn't belong to you. Breaking free doesn't mean rejecting society altogether. It means choosing consciously which rules you live by and which ones you refuse to carry. It means realizing that you don't need permission to live in alignment with your own truth. Think of it like decluttering your mind. Just as you would clean out a closet filled with clothes that no longer fit, you need to release the outdated beliefs and impose standards that no longer serve who you are becoming. There's a profound liberation that comes the moment you let go of the need to please everyone else. The anxiety softens, the inner critic quiets, and you begin to breathe again, deeply, fully, freely. You start to notice what you want. Maybe it's a simpler life. Maybe it's a more adventurous one. Maybe it's one filled with art, travel, or spiritual practice. Whatever it is, it doesn't have to make sense to anyone but you. And here's the paradox. When you stop trying to meet the world's expectations, the world actually begins to meet you where you are. The opportunities that align with your true path reveal themselves. The people who resonate with your authenticity show up. The life that once felt like a constant performance begins to feel like an unfolding journey, raw, real, and deeply fulfilling. You see, freedom is not found in following the script, it's found in writing your own. And when you dare to step outside that box, you not only liberate yourself, you give silent permission for others to do the same. You become a living reminder that it's okay to choose differently. It's okay to live a life that's not ordinary. It's okay to let go of should and embrace want. The chains of expectation may feel heavy, but they are only as strong as the power you give them. The moment you choose yourself over the noise of the crowd is the moment you unlock a life that feels like yours, truly yours. And as you learn to shed the weight of external judgment, something even more powerful begins to happen. You start stepping into a deeper sense of self-trust, a connection to your inner compass that no outside voice can silence. And that, as we'll soon discover, is where the true path forward lies. There's a quiet guide that has always been with you, so subtle, so gentle, that most of the time it gets drowned out by the noise of the world. That guide is your inner voice, your intuition, the part of you that whispers the truth even when everything around you is screaming the opposite. For years, many of us are taught to ignore it. We're told to be logical, to follow the rules, to look for proof, to listen to authority. But deep down, haven't you noticed? There's always that little tug, that small sense of knowing. Maybe it was when you met someone and instantly felt they were trustworthy, or not. Maybe it was when you faced a choice and something in your gut told you which way to go, even if it made no sense on paper. That's the voice I'm talking about. The reason we lose touch with it is because society trains us to prioritize external validation. Grades, promotions, likes, approval. Everything becomes about chasing signals outside of us. Over time, we forget how to trust what's inside. But here's the truth. Your inner voice has access to wisdom that logic alone cannot reach. It's like a compass pointing you back toward authenticity, back toward the life that's meant for you. Listening to it doesn't mean ignoring reason. It means learning to balance reason with intuition. Logic can analyze, compare, and plan. Intuition can sense, feel, and reveal. Together, they create decisions that are both wise and aligned. Think of it like music. Logic is the sheet of notes, but intuition is the rhythm and soul. Without one, the other feels incomplete. But how do you begin to hear it again? The first step is silence. When your mind is cluttered with noise, the inner voice becomes almost impossible to detect. Meditation, walks in nature, journaling, these are not luxuries. They are doorways back to yourself. In that stillness, you'll notice gentle nudges. Sometimes it's a sudden clarity. Other times it's a soft pull in one direction. The key is to notice it before your rational mind rushes in to dismiss it. And here's the thing. The more you listen, the stronger it becomes. The more you act on it, the more it proves itself trustworthy. You begin to see synchronicities, doors opening, paths aligning. And even when challenges appear, you feel anchored because you know you're moving in harmony with something deeper than fear or doubt. It takes courage to follow this voice. People around you might not understand. They may question your choices, warn you, or even laugh at you. But their noise does not matter because they are not the ones living your life. You are. And when you live guided by your inner compass, even the unknown becomes less frightening because you trust that the path will rise to meet you. When you reconnect with that voice, you stop searching desperately outside yourself for answers. You realize the clarity you've been chasing was never out there. It was always here, within you. And as this inner trust deepens, something profound happens. Your sense of self-worth begins to flourish. You no longer depend on others to validate your choices because you finally recognize the power of your own truth. There's a word so small, so simple, yet so powerful that it can completely transform the way you live. No. And yet for many of us, this word feels heavy on the tongue. We hesitate, we soften it, we avoid it. Why? Because we're afraid of disappointing others, afraid of conflict, afraid of being judged as selfish, difficult, or unkind. So we say yes when we really want to say no. We overextend ourselves. We carry responsibilities that don't belong to us. And slowly, quietly, we begin to feel drained, resentful, and trapped. But here's the truth. Every time you say yes to something that doesn't serve you, you are unconsciously saying no to yourself. You're saying no to your time, your energy, your well-being, your dreams. And isn't your life too precious to be lived in constant sacrifice for the comfort of others? Saying no is not about rejection. it's about protection. It's about protecting the space you need to grow, the peace you need to breathe, the energy you need to invest in what truly matters. It's drawing a boundary that says, I respect myself enough not to be consumed by what isn't right for me. Of course, it takes courage. The first time you say it, your voice might shake. You might second-guess yourself. The people around you might not like it, especially if they've grown accustomed to your constant yes. But that discomfort is temporary. What lasts is the freedom that follows. The more you practice, the stronger you become. Soon, no stops being a weapon of defense and becomes a declaration of self-respect. Think about it. Some of the most meaningful opportunities in life only appear because you had the courage to close the wrong doors first. By saying no to obligations that drain you, you create space for experiences that fulfill you. By saying no to relationships that diminish you, you create room for connections that uplift you. By saying no to a life scripted by others, you begin saying yes to a life that belongs to you. And here's the paradox. The more authentic your no becomes, the more valuable your yes becomes. When you say yes now, it comes from a place of truth, not obligation. People can feel the difference. It's lighter, stronger, more real. So, the next time you feel that tightening in your chest, that small voice whispering that this isn't right for you, pause. Breathe. Trust yourself. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to say the word they least expect but you most need. No. And when you learn to honor your no, you begin to unlock a deeper understanding of balance, the kind that transforms not just your choices, but your entire way of living. There's something magnetic about a person who is unapologetically themselves. They don't force, they don't pretend, they don't bend into shapes that don't fit. They simply are. And somehow opportunities, relationships, and possibilities seem to flow toward them effortlessly. Why does this happen? Because authenticity is rare, and rare things draw attention. Most people spend so much of their lives wearing masks. At work, at home, even with friends, they play roles to fit expectations. And when someone shows up without a mask, when someone dares to live in alignment with who they truly are, it feels refreshing. It feels trustworthy. It feels real. Opportunities, whether they are personal or professional, don't just land in your lap because of luck. They're drawn to energy, to alignment, to resonance. When you live authentically, you send out a signal that says, this is me. This is what I value. This is where I'm going. And the world responds. The right people recognize you. The right doors open. The right paths appear. It's not about being perfect. It's about being consistent with your truth. People can sense when you're faking it. They can sense when you're people-pleasing. But they can also sense when you're grounded in who you are. And that grounding creates trust, the foundation of every opportunity worth having. Think about it this way. Pretending to be someone else might win you temporary approval, but it won't bring you lasting success or fulfillment. Eventually, the mask slips. But when you lead with authenticity, whatever you attract is built on solid ground because it's attracted to the real you, not the version you invented to be accepted. Yes, authenticity takes courage. It means risking rejection. It means some people will walk away because you no longer fit their mold. But the beauty is that the ones who stay, the ones who are drawn in, are the people and opportunities that truly belong in your life. They don't need you to shrink or to change. They need you to shine exactly as you are. And here's the secret most people overlook. Authenticity isn't just attractive, it's liberating. When you stop wasting energy on maintaining an image, you free up that energy to create, to grow, to pursue what really excites you. And in that state of freedom, opportunities don't just find you, you're finally ready to seize them. So the next time you feel the temptation to dim your light, to hide your quirks, to smooth over your truth just to fit in, pause. Ask yourself, what might I be blocking by pretending? Because chances are the very thing you're hoping for, the chance, the breakthrough, the connection, is waiting on the other side of your authenticity. Live honestly, live boldly, and watch how the world begins to arrange itself around the power of your truth. At some point, you have to ask yourself a question so simple, yet so powerful. Am I living my life, Or am I living the version others expect of me? For many, the answer is painful. From childhood, we're guided, nudged, even pressured into paths we didn't choose. A career that seemed safe. A relationship that felt appropriate. A lifestyle that looked successful. Piece by piece, we start building a life designed not by our own dreams but by someone else's script. And then one day, in a quiet moment, you feel it, a dull emptiness. A sense that something is missing even though you've checked all the boxes. That's the whisper of your soul reminding you this isn't really you. Living your own life doesn't mean throwing everything away. It doesn't mean rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It means pausing long enough to ask, what do I actually want? What matters to me? What kind of life feels true in my bones, not just on paper? It might look different from what people expect. Maybe your family dreamed of you being a doctor, but your heart beats for art. Maybe society told you marriage and kids were the only path, but your truth is freedom and exploration. Maybe you've been praised for being reliable, but deep down you crave adventure and risk. Whatever it is, your life is too short to be lived as an echo of someone else's dream. And here's the paradox. When you dare to live your life fully and honestly, you don't just serve yourself, you serve the world. Because nothing is more inspiring than someone who is alive with their own truth. They remind others that it's possible. They give permission for authenticity. They radiate a kind of energy that can't be faked. Of course, choosing your path takes courage. People will have opinions. Some may not understand. Some may even try to pull you back into the mold you've escaped. But remember, their discomfort is not your responsibility. Their expectations are not your obligation. You are not here to live their story. You are here to write your own. Imagine reaching the end of your days and realizing you lived courageously, not perfectly, but authentically, knowing your choices were yours, your joys were real, your struggles were meaningful. That is a life well lived. So take the pen back, start editing the script. Even small changes, a boundary drawn, a passion pursued, a truth spoken, can shift your life toward authenticity. Because little by little, choice by choice, you begin to feel it. The freedom of living a life that finally feels like yours. And when you do, the approval of others fades into the background. The noise of comparison quiets down. What remains is peace, alignment, and the unshakable truth that you are exactly where you're meant to be. So here we are at the end of this journey. And maybe, just maybe, you feel something has shifted. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet recognition. Your life truly begins when you choose yourself. For so long, we're taught that putting ourselves first is selfish. But now you see it's the exact opposite. It's the key to freedom, to love, to peace. When you honor your needs, your boundaries, your truth, you don't close yourself off from the world. You finally open to it, because you're no longer operating from resentment, exhaustion, or pretense. You're living from fullness, and fullness overflows. Think of it like a cup. If yours is always empty because you pour into everyone else without ever refilling, eventually there's nothing left to give. But when you fill your own cup first, when you nourish your mind, body, and soul, you can share with others from abundance, not depletion. That's not selfish. That's sustainable love. And the world responds to that energy. Opportunities align. Relationships deepen. Peace settles in where chaos used to live. You no longer chase what isn't meant for you because what is meant for you naturally finds its way. The universe loves a soul that chooses truth. So remember this, putting yourself first is not about building walls. It's about building a foundation strong enough to carry the life you deserve. It's about saying yes to yourself so the world can finally say yes to you. As you step forward from here, let this truth echo within you. Every no that protects your peace, every yes that honors your heart, every choice that reflects your worth is a doorway. A doorway into a life that feels lighter, truer, more alive. You don't need to wait for permission. You don't need to justify it. The world has been waiting, not for you to prove yourself, but for you to become yourself. So go ahead, choose you, stand tall in your truth, and watch with quiet wonder as the world opens wide in response. Because when you finally put yourself first, life doesn't get smaller, it expands. it becomes everything you always hoped it could be and more. If these words spoke to your heart, let them stay with you. Let them guide you back to yourself again and again. And if you wish to keep walking this path of wisdom and peace, I invite you to stay close. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, so together we can continue exploring the teachings that remind us how to live with clarity, compassion, and courage. And if this message touched you, share it with someone who may need a gentle reminder that their life, too, deserves to be lived fully and authentically. The journey doesn't end here. It only deepens. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for choosing in this moment to honor yourself. Until we meet again, may you walk in peace with an open heart and a spirit unafraid to shine.